from Mark Kremen. And Mark, this is the first time we've met in person, but we've been meeting each other on Zoom for 2 years. So it's really, really nice to meet you tonight. Mark is a Skokomish nation elder who has worked with Native American and church relations within the Lutheran Church for over 35 years. He was active in the Washington Association of Churches and was a part of the Declaration of Apology, offered at the first Indigenous meeting of the Americas in 1987 in Quito, Ecuador. And Mark is going to offer a prayer for us in Coast Salish.
You ready? You ready? Hello? Is that? I got to you read it. Ready? Hikasadabad. Sasidai, the Bialas, Savalabas, Dwa Kia, Dwa Sadai, Da Dabad, Da Sladai Chachas, Dwa Bek Siaya Iaa, Iaa Baktas. Dwa dialas balusabab dialas asulabad di chit dialas sasidai dwa dabad dwa bada aa. God, I am in prayer. Very good that we gather. To our grandmothers, to our grandfathers, to our mothers, to our fathers, to our children, to all people, I pray for our time here. To all of us, heal us. To all of us, stand by us. It's very glad that you are with us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Deep gratitude to Mark for that prayer. Thank you so much. I want to welcome Pastor Laura Krutzinger Perry for a welcome from the United Churches of Olympia.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you, everyone. My name is Laura Krutzinger Perry. I'm the pastor here at the United Churches. I use she, they pronouns, and I just want to say welcome to this space offered to you tonight as a place of healing, a place that is open to people of all faiths. If you're new to the United Churches, please make yourselves at home. Let us know if there's anything that you need. It is important for you to know that we are a progressive community that's seeking to live out our faith through acts of love and justice and kindness. And if you're joining us by Zoom, we are also very grateful that you are here with us from wherever you call home. We are indeed grateful at United Churches that Interfaith Works calls this building their home as well, and that we can be in partnership with them. And so as we gather today, we acknowledge that Thurston County is the traditional territory of the Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin, and Chehalis people. The surrounding mountains, valleys, shorelines, and waterways are imbued with their presence, past, present, and future. So may we nourish our relationship with our coastal Salish neighbors and our shared responsibility to this place, their homeland, where we mutually abide. As people of faith, let us also give thanks to the beauty of this place and the richness of all the creation that calls this region their home, and to the God of creation who is embodied in it. By this acknowledgement, may we affirm our obligation to earn the trust of the tribal nations, to strengthen our relationships, to uphold tribal sovereignty, and to work together as friends and neighbors in community with respect so that we can protect and serve our communities. And it is indeed my most earnest prayer that the result of this time together and times like this, that we will collectively work to create opportunities to engage in relationship, service, and reparations to our Indigenous siblings. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Pastor Laura. We want to recognize one of the co-sponsors for the event tonight, which is the Faith Action Network. The executive director, Lisa Goyer, was not able to be here tonight, though she wanted to be here, so she sends regards and I think is attending on Zoom, maybe. But if you're there, Elise, thank you for all the good big work you're doing, and we're just thrilled to be partnering with the Faith Action Network. Also want to welcome Meg Martin, the executive director of Interfaith Works, to say a word of welcome to. Hello, Meg.
Thank you, Corey. Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Hello to everyone on Zoom. Interfaith Works is thrilled to be hosting tonight's event. Thank you, Sarah, for sharing so much of your time, knowledge, experience, and passion with us tonight. We are grateful to the United Churches for being home to our offices and continuing to share community with us for so many years, and as we've slowly taken over the basement, room by room. Thank you to the Faith Action Network for partnering on tonight's event, and again to all of you. Tonight is Interfaith Works' first Indigenous Peoples Day event. While we have been on a steady path towards deepening our commitment to racial justice over the past 5 years in our organization, whenever we look at ways in which our community can become more loving, more just, and more committed to dismantling racism, we must always look at ourselves first. We are so happy to be partnering tonight and want to explicitly acknowledge that this is the first time we've publicly honored Indigenous Peoples Day as an organization since the observation of this important day began in 1977. Black, Indigenous, Brown, and all people of color are disproportionately represented in the homeless community in Thurston County by nearly double of that of the general population. Just last year, a beloved friend of mine and someone who accessed our services regularly, Michelle, was found dead near the Woodland Park Trail. And it turned out that her family had listed her as a missing Indigenous woman, but we didn't know that until after she had passed and we were coordinating with her family about memorial plans. These issues of structural racism, violence, the daily impacts of colonialism on our community are happening now. They are happening here in Thurston County. We hope that you will join us on our path towards recognizing these truths, practicing reconciliation, and always remaining open to learning more. There's always more transformation possible, and I'm looking forward to how Interfaith Works' expression for justice continues to evolve as we learn and listen more intentionally. We do not and cannot do this work alone. Our community is a sacred place, and we are so lucky to have all of you in it. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
So now it's my joy to introduce our keynote and guest tonight, Sarah Augustine. Sarah, thank you for being here today. We're so appreciative of you and your ongoing, long, enduring work that you're doing. We're just thrilled to have you tonight as a guest, and strength to you in the coming days and years as you continue your good work. Sarah is the former executive director of the Dispute Resolution Center of Yakima and Kittitas counties, and is the co-founder and executive director of the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition, and author of The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus in Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, which I think there might be some copies left, but if not, there's one copy. But you can get it through Orca Books or any local bookstores or others if you want or need to do that. But it's an excellent book. I've read it. Tomorrow morning, Sarah will be my guest on the Lean In Olympia episode, where we'll explore some of the book and some of the things that you've shared in the book. So I'm looking forward to that, and that episode will post sometime tomorrow. She's also the co-founder of the Suriname Indigenous Health Fund, which she has advocated for vulnerable Indigenous peoples since 2004. So Sarah, thank you so much. Warm welcome to you. Yeah, totally.
So good to be here in this In this age, I've got my phone because it's there where my notes are. So I'm not texting with my friends or anything at the moment. Yeah, boy, what a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm so thankful and grateful to get to be here amongst people from my own community in Washington State. I don't find myself in this context very often these days. And just hello to the people on Zoom, the community we've all built together over the last several years, encountering each other virtually. So let's see, I am ready for the slides to start. It's a pleasure to be here with you on Indigenous Peoples Day. Many of you, do you remember Columbus Day? When you were growing up, do you remember, the activities you used to do for Columbus Day? Dressing up and talking about what a great thing the discovery of America was. And so we honor Indigenous Peoples Day as a form of acknowledging the brilliance and the resilience of Indigenous peoples in North America and around the world, and also acknowledging the ongoing reality of colonization. So the historical process of colonization that has brought us to where we are today, and the ongoing process of colonization that defines reality for Indigenous peoples today. And in fact, defines reality for all of you as well. That colonization has not only defined the past, but the present. And so we gather to remember what's come before, understanding that as we remember, this is actually an act of resistance. And also to join together and shape the future. So I often think about how I am the person in the world today that is descended from my ancestors. And I get to spend my life energy representing them in the world today, as do we all. Each one of us has the opportunity today in our lives and every day to shape reality. And in fact, we are doing that, whether we acknowledge it or not. So I learned from an elder, Stan McKay. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, a Cree elder, who was very much a part of creating the context for the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada. And he taught me this idea of the transversal worldview, or this understanding that we are, all of us, related. That actually we live in a closed system of mutual dependence. And this idea of transversal orientation is the acknowledgement that everything I do impacts you and everything else, all my relatives, not just human beings, but the four-legged also, and the winged ones, and what my mentor, Steve Darden, taught me to call the standing green nation, all the plants and all the flora that we depend on for our survival, and also each other. And so in this worldview, you are all my relations. So I greet you all, my relatives. Next slide. Next slide, please. So I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more because I think it's important to understand who's standing in front of you here. I am an Indigenous woman by race. And I want to be really clear about that. So when I get the census form and you check the box of what race you are, I check Native American, Indigenous, because that's who I'm from. Those are my people. My grandmother and grandfather were the people of the Round Earth, the Tewa people of the Nambe Pueblo. My father was born in 1944. You see a picture of him there with me. That's me and my dad in the 70s. Check out our awesome threads there. He was born in 1944, and he was removed from the care of his mother in the hospital. And so he actually was placed in a Catholic boys' home 300 miles away from his people and his family and his language and his land. And he grew up in that context, completely separated from his people. And so I do not have tribal affiliation, because tribal affiliation is actually a political identity. It is not a racial identity. By race, I am Native American. I'm an Indigenous woman. But as in terms of my political identity, I locate myself as a displaced person, as an internally displaced person, because my family and my people were removed from our land and effectively became refugees within our country of origin. So while I am a United States citizen, I consider myself to be, according to the UN definition, an internally displaced person. And so the reason I'm telling you all of this is because I think it's important to understand, as we get into talking about the Indian Child Welfare Act and the details of that and how that impacts us today, to understand that tribal affiliation is defined by Indigenous tribes. So Indigenous tribes determine who are the members, the citizens within their care, and that is separate from a racial identity. All right, next slide, please. So I got to tell you a little bit about myself. Actually, I forgot to tell you a crucial piece of it. I moved to Washington in 1998, and I've lived here ever since. I came here to go to the University of Washington, and I married a tall northern man, and that was the end of it. So I've been here ever since. And but I live on the Confederated Bands and Tribes, the homeland of the Confederated Bands and Tribes of the Yakama Nation. So I'm a guest living on the Indian reservation, the Yakama Indian Reservation in central Washington. So I'm an Indigenous woman living on Indigenous land that is not my own. So I live in an Indigenous context. So that's me. So now you know quite a lot about me. And I'd like to now take time to hear a little more about you. And so what I'd like to do, I'd like for us to have a short discussion together. In fact, I'd like you to just pair up, or three of you together, discuss one value that defines you. What is a value that defines you, or that is really important? It guides you, and it's a way that you orient yourself in the world. And just to give you a prompt here, Interfaith Works values social justice and peace through interfaith understanding and cooperation. So I'd like you to just spend a few minutes in a pair or three of you sharing with each other a core value. And before I send you that, I will tell you a core value for me is self-determination. Perhaps a very core, maybe the core value for me, self-determination. What is it for you? Let's just take a few minutes to talk about that together. So in the perfect world, you would each share about 3 minutes each.
Hi, I don't know if anyone can hear me. Okay, you're muted if you're saying you can hear me, Debbie. I was the only person in my breakout room, so I came back.
Hi.
Hi. So, and somebody just messaged that she also, or they also were the only person in their breakout room. So there's a few of us that system did not work for.
Yeah. Now I've got an invitation on my screen.
I did the invitation and I ended up alone.
Are you Corey?
I am Julia Cochran.
Yeah, that's what it says. Okay.
I'm just a person. So there's 4 of us that says 46. I don't know how many of us can hear me. Because I was thinking we could be our own small group.
Well, everybody else that I can see is muted.
That's true.
So I assume they can't hear us.
No, that's not the same thing. They can hear us, they just can't speak.
Oh,
Hi there. I went to a chat, whatever they call it, a room,
Breakout
and
room.
nobody else came there. So I'll join you if you want.
Yeah, that's what happened to me. So why don't we do our own little thingamajiggy? And so I would say that the value that's driven my life is that
package.
everybody has a right to be. And so therefore, if everybody has a right to be, they have a right to have a place to be. So I'm a homeless advocate.
Can you mute, please?
Out of what?
We don't want to mute. We want to have our conversation because there was no one to talk to in the breakout rooms.
You're talking to everybody that's participating.
We were supposed to be in breakout rooms. Okay, bye.
I don't know. This isn't working very well. I can see the bottom of the piano.
Okay. So I am going to ask at least a few of you to tell me what you heard. Poor folks at the front always get the mic put in their face. Are you willing? Just one thing you heard.
We talked about authenticity and awakeness, aliveness, being with what is.
Thank you. Over here, one thing you heard.
Well, the 4 values we heard named were acceptance, and somebody help me out here. What were other words? World citizen, learning, peacemaking, yeah.
Thank you. And I'll take one more. And as you're speaking, if you could speak directly into the microphone, that's going to make it easier for everyone else to hear. Ready?
Community, but community as a verb, not just a noun.
Yeah, I love that. So the purpose of this exercise is for you to hear who's with you in the room. Who are we here together as members of the community and also Interfaith Works? What are the things that we value collectively? I think that's an important place to start as we start to try and think through how we embark on seeking justice together. Where are we starting from? So I'm ready for the next slide. Have you heard of the Doctrine of Discovery? Some of you have heard of that. You know, I wrote a book about the Doctrine of Discovery. It's really interesting. Some of the reviews that came out, people said, you know, the Catholic law from the 1400s. How many of you know that the Doctrine of Discovery is a current legal doctrine? That it is a legal doctrine in the United States that creates reality for Indigenous peoples today. A few of you know that. Yeah. It's a legal doctrine, right? And so what the heck is a legal doctrine? What does that even mean? What is a doctrine? Well, it's a paradigm. It's a framework for interpreting the law. It's the framework that the Supreme Court uses to interpret what's called Indian law in the United States as it pertains to land. It's also a framework for creating law. And so within the coalition, the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery coalition that I'm a part of, half of what we do is focus on dismantling structures, laws, and policies. And the other half of what we do is focusing on changing the culture, because we recognize those things inform each other. But, you know, it sounds a little bit dry. It's a legal doctrine. Why would we spend time thinking about it and working to dismantle it? I've actually had people say to me at talks like this, you know, Sarah, you need a better phrase. That phrase is not really catchy. And well, I think we're stuck with it because it is the legal framework today that defines reality for Indigenous peoples in this country and also in other parts of what is called the discovered world, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and many other places around the world, including South America, the countries of South America, Africa, India. Wherever colonization took place, the Doctrine of Discovery, with the exception of very few countries, is still the law of the land. So what the heck is discovery anyway? Well, it was a doctrine that was created by the church so that European states would not go to war with each other over territory. The idea was that, you know, the first arrival, the first Christian monarch that arrived in a place would have the right of first discovery. And if they discovered it, they were able to capture it for the monarch that they were representing. And if there happened to be human beings there, those people did not count as inhabitants unless they were the subjects of a Christian monarch. And the term for this is terra nullius, which means empty land, which is why the name of my book is The Land is Not Empty. Because by discovery, European states or Christian states had the right to claim land regardless of who was on it. If you had to guess, the most recent time the Doctrine of Discovery itself was cited as the basis for a legal decision by the Supreme Court, what year would you say that happened? Yeah, 2005. Oh, there's a ringer. We have a ringer. Okay, well, let me ask you another question. Knowing who's on the court, and some of you probably do, who would you guess wrote the opinion for the majority? Ideas? Roberts, good guess. Ginsburg, also a good guess. Yeah, it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is, the symbol of progressive judges in the United States. She wrote the majority, and in her majority opinion, she wrote, "This is a matter of settled law. It's not in question. The United States government has the inherent right to own all land, and that's all. It's not in question. It's a matter of settled law." So that is the Doctrine of Discovery as it stands today. And it defines reality for Indigenous peoples. Through many policy eras in the United States, the primary objective of the federal government has been to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. And there have been not just one policy or even a body of policy, but policy eras over time. And over time, these policy eras have used different tactics for removing Indigenous peoples from their lands. And we are in one. We are in a policy era, folks. This is not just a historical thing that happened once upon a time. We are now in an era with the objective that remains to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. And from my point of view, the most effective policy we've ever had for Indigenous removal in this country has been child removal. When Europeans landed in North America, it is estimated there were 100 million Indigenous people here. In the United States, there are now 6 million Indigenous people in the United States. Many Indigenous people are like me. 70% of us live off the reservation. That is to say, without tribal affiliation. Because it's been a very effective policy movement to remove children from Indigenous lands with the objective of eradicating Indigenous people. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. I would now like to ask you to talk with another partner or three of you and ask you, what do you think of when you hear the word sovereignty? What does sovereignty mean to you? When you hear that word sovereignty, let's talk about that for just a few minutes. So once again, each person in an ideal world would have 3 minutes to share. All right, folks. I think let's do this the way we did it last time. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think of when you hear the word sovereignty? And of course, I'm gonna pick on a ringer here. A few words, briefly.
We discussed it in the context of the right to make, administer, and enforce laws. The right and responsibility to make, administer, and enforce laws that govern all people.
Like it. A technical response. How about you guys? What did you hear?
We came up with a couple different words: control, power, and then autonomy.
I like that. Yeah. I'll take one from this side of the room. Looking for eye contact, scanning.
We talked about self-rule, also control, and I'd have to have them help me out more too. But I think that kind of summarizes it.
All right. Next slide, please. I started my talk sharing with you a little about my identity and my story to really make clear that when we're talking about the doctrine of discovery and when we're talking about reality for Indigenous peoples today, it's not sort of a bygone era or a historical thing that people are talking about. My life has been defined by the doctrine of discovery. Actually, the reality for me has been defined by the doctrine of discovery. And I'm going to go into a little bit more about this here and continue to share with you. So there were boarding schools where the federal government actually mandated that Indigenous children be removed from their families from 1896 to the 1970s. Did you know there were boarding schools that were still in operation in this country until the 90s? Many people don't know that. Yeah, but in the 1970s we entered into a new phase of self-determination for Indigenous peoples at the federal level, that new era. But it's estimated, we don't have actual numbers because there were not records kept in the United States like there were in Canada. But it's estimated 60,000 children were in boarding schools by 1925. So many children were removed from their families and put into boarding schools. And I can't overemphasize that this was really a partnership between the federal government and churches. That churches entered into relationship with the federal government to remove Indigenous peoples' children from their families. And the thinking was that, I believe, among churches, that this was a good thing. This was a charitable thing to do for Native children, to remove them from their families, because it would give them the opportunity to have a better life. And we hear this language again and again and again as a justification for removing Indigenous children from their homes and from their families. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Brackeen case, the Brackeen versus Holland case that's ongoing right now, which is putting the Indian Child Welfare Act at risk. And in that case, a central argument is that the child that a white family wants to adopt will be better off, they will have a better life if they remain with a white family than if they're with one of their own relatives, because of different financial standing. Anyway, we had boarding schools from 1896 to the 1970s. Many people don't realize that there was forced sterilization of Indigenous women by Indian Health Service through the 1970s. So women who would go to the hospital to give birth, but also for routine things like having their tonsils removed, would be sterilized in the hospital. It was estimated, with government estimates, that 25 to 50% of Native women had been sterilized by 1976, with the purpose of reducing the number of Indigenous people, to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. At the end of the boarding school era, the Indian Adoption Project came into play. Are you familiar with this? Have you heard of this? This is also less known about, the Indian Adoption Project. So as boarding schools were being wound down, it was understood that that was unjust to remove kids in this way. There was a movement to acquire Native children, and between 1958 and 67, there was this massive effort, once again, between the federal government and churches to put Native children in adoptive homes. So to find Native homes unfit for Native children, most often justified by neglect. And so neglect was defined by poverty. So in Native homes where social workers would come and inspect and felt that was not an adequate home environment, they were empowered to remove those children and put them in adoptive homes with Christian families. And so there was a federal inquiry into this, and that inquiry led to the Indian Child Welfare Act. At the time of that congressional inquiry, 25% of Native children were living outside of their families, homes, and lands. And of those 25%, 90% were living in white homes. So at the end of the boarding school era, states were empowered to take custody of Indigenous children and place them. And there was another partnership built between the federal government and churches to put Native children in white homes or in Christian homes. Next slide, please. So I started with the story of my own family and my own life, that my father was removed from his family and home and put into a Catholic boys' home. And I want to tell you a little bit about that home. It was not a foster home. It was a work camp. So he grew up on a farm and served as labor and endured physical and emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and really became damaged as a result of that. So my dad is not a person who was kind of a success story that rose above it and triumphed over all. He had a hard life. And as a result of that, I had a hard life. I grew up in a very chaotic and violent environment. As a result of that, once again, the way that my life has been defined by the Doctrine of Discovery, far away from my own people and my own lands. The public health literature calls access to culture and language and kinship protective factors. So historically marginalized groups are at high risk of drug abuse, alcoholism, mental health issues, and suicide. And protective factors are access to language, culture, kin. Those things insulate people from those social problems. And I grew up without those protective factors, as do many Indigenous people. Keep in mind, 70% of us today live off reservation. Many of us are people like me who are not, do not have tribal affiliation. So that's my story about, that's my experience when it comes to losing a child, is that it has an impact across generations. Has impact across generations. But I would like for you to share with each other if you have experience of losing a child or child loss. I would like for you to share that experience. What is your experience when it comes to losing a child? Let's take same amount of time, maybe 3 minutes each to share about that. Understanding that we locate our understanding of the world in our own lives. Okay, I'm gonna call you back. Call your attention back to the group. So this question is a really tough one. And we're growing deeper in relationship together in confronting this kind of question. And I'll say again, the reason that we go here is because we acknowledge that who we are in the world and the way we view reality is rooted in our own story. And so I'm not going to go around and ask you to share that, but I will ask if anybody wants to share something. If you want to raise your hand, I'd be happy to hear. Yeah, thank you. Let me bring the mic over to you.
My loss was maybe not as severe as a death loss, and so maybe it's easier to share. My brother, one of my brothers, fell in love with a woman who was insecure in his love for her, and so separated him from his family. And I was very close to this brother, and really didn't talk to him for 20 years after that marriage. Maybe it was a little less than that. Maybe it was 15 years. She eventually passed on, and the relationship with my brother was rebuilt. And I would say that in that healing process, first of all, my mother was amazing. The solid, ongoing love, despite the circumstances. But I would say that before she passed on, before his wife passed on, my relationship with her was healed. But she still didn't want me to spend time with my brother. So these healing processes, I can just imagine, the depth of them for people who've had more severe situations.
Thank you for being willing to share that with us and to go there. Because, as we're growing as a community and we are endeavoring together to seek justice, we have to know each other. In this coalition I'm a part of, Dismantling Doctrine of Discovery Coalition, we often will say, we come by conviction and we stay out of love, because we're struggling together. So we live together and work together side by side and hear each other's stories over years of time. And that is what builds the capacity and the resilience to keep going. So I thank you for being willing to be vulnerable with each other and to share with each other a little bit of your own story. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, can you go back? I have to say something about this picture because it's kind of an odd picture. It's a hammock. This is a hammock inside a home in Suriname, South America. It's the home of a friend of mine, actually, who lost her first child, her little baby, who was born very deformed as a result to exposure to mercury from gold mining in that region. And the reason I have a picture of her hammock here is because she buried her child under her hammock. So her child is buried there. And as a result of the Doctrine of Discovery, that people does not have land rights, so they can be moved at any time. Imagine being moved when your child is buried under your hammock. Next slide, please. Okay, getting to the point here. It's taken us a while. The Indian Child Welfare Act. So in 1977, I told you before 25%, but Congress estimated 25 to 35% of all American Indian children had been separated from their families and placed in foster homes, adoptive homes, or institutions. And 90% of those were placed in non-Indian homes, so no protective factors. No protective factors. Next slide, please. So the Indian Child Welfare Act was put into place to protect Native American families and to keep Native American families intact. And essentially what it did is it provided the right, or I should say acknowledged the right, of Native American tribes to have a say, a seat at the table in the placement of Native American children. So if a child was a member of a Native American tribe, or to this day, has the potential to be a member. So if it's an infant and it doesn't yet have tribal affiliation, but there's the potential to prove that, then that nation and that nation's child welfare agency has the right to have a say in the placement of that child. And this is a matter of sovereignty from my point of view. This is a matter of self-determination for Indigenous tribes. They have the right to say where a child will be placed if that child is removed. And the purpose of the Indian Child Welfare Act was not to exclude families from the dominant culture from ever fostering or adopting a Native child, but rather to provide preference, first of all, to a kinship group, to a relative who's kin to that child. In 1978, that was a pretty radical thing, but it's actually considered the gold standard practice today in the United States, that children that have to be removed from their parents, if they're separated from their parents, would be placed with a relative first. They would then also have preference for being placed in the home of another member of their tribe, so that they would have access to those protective factors of their community. And finally, if there isn't a family placement, if there isn't a tribal placement, they could be placed in the home of another Native American tribe, so that Native children would be able to grow up on their own lands, right, among their own people, or among people who at least understand what it is to be Native American. This lessens the trauma of removal from a family of origin by placement with family and community. It also helps state welfare agencies access critical services when they need to for Native American children. Next slide, please. There is a lawsuit, I'm sure many of you have heard about it, challenging the Indian Child Welfare Act today. And in fact, did you know that ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, has been challenged more than the Affordable Care Act? Do you remember the Affordable Care Act being challenged over and over and over, dozens and dozens of times? ICWA has been challenged more often than that. And the Supreme Court is due to hear opening statements on this case, Brackeen versus Holland, on November 9th. So the Indian Child Welfare Act is under threat. And given the last several Supreme Court decisions with this new court, the composition of the new court, their last several decisions relating to Indigenous peoples have not been promoting self-determination for Indigenous peoples. They have not been promoting sovereignty for Indigenous nations. And so there is a risk that the Indian Child Welfare Act will be found unconstitutional. So the argument that's being made in a nutshell in opposition to the Indian Child Welfare Act is that it is racially motivated. So according to the 14th Amendment, if there is a law that is considered to be racist, the Protection Clause protects people from being harmed or damaged by that law. So that's the basis of this legal argument, that actually the Indian Child Welfare Act has a racial basis and that it is harming and damaging Indigenous children as a result of that. Would you believe me if I told you that there are churches today who are working collectively to remove Indigenous children from their homes and saying that they are doing this as a calling to provide those children access to a better life? And in fact, the Brackeen family has stated that this is their reason for wanting to have custody of the children in their care is because they can provide a better life to those children. So I'm going to break it down a little bit. The Brackeens are the adoptive parents of a Native child. They were not barred from adopting a Native child. When their child had a sibling, they wanted to also adopt that sibling. That sibling, however, was placed by their tribe with a relative. And so the Brackeens are filing this suit in protest of that because they would like to adopt that second child as well, the sibling. And they're saying that they can provide a much better life to this child than their relative can because of the lifestyle that they'll be able to provide to that child. In a nutshell, that's the Brackeen case. So I'm going to read this quote to you. Today, the lawsuit challenging ICWA doesn't just impact the future of one child or even the future of one law. It threatens the entire legal structure defending Native American rights because ICWA acknowledges the inherent right of Indigenous tribes to advocate for Indigenous children. Next slide, please. If the Indian Child Welfare Act is allowed to be struck down, the systems of assimilation that ruled the realities of Indigenous children, families, and peoples in the United States will be placed in motion once more. It will mean the next step, and perhaps the last step in assimilation for Indigenous children and peoples. What is the purpose of child removal? It is a policy priority to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. It is the most effective policy that there has ever been for removing Indigenous peoples from their lands. Among my people, over the last decade, tribal membership is declining because of this process. Not just among my people, but among many peoples. Next slide, please. The connection of the Indian Child Welfare Act challenge and the Doctrine of Discovery is the use of law and policy to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. The Doctrine of Discovery is a legal structure in place to determine who has the right to own and improve and inhabit land. And the removal of the Indian Child Welfare Act will be a very powerful decimation of Indigenous people's rights to self-determination. It will also be a disaster for Indigenous children. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I don't think it's a terrible thing for any child to grow up in a family or a home of the dominant culture. That's not really what this is about. It's possible for members of the dominant culture to adopt Native children. It is a disaster to grow up without connection to your own culture or people, or without connection to your own identity, or any way to make sense of race in the United States, growing up in the United States, without support, a way to understand that. I am so grateful and thankful that I have had the opportunity to raise my child on the Yakima Reservation. So he's grown up his entire life surrounded by Indigenous people. And that's been it's been such a great source of healing for me. For him, I'm not sure what he thinks about it other than it's just normal. Feels normal to him. He's teaching himself Japanese. But meanwhile, his best friends are Native kids. He has a girlfriend who's a Native girl. His whole life, he's grown up in an Indigenous environment. But I didn't. I grew up without that kind of context. And it was really challenging. It was really challenging to go to the doctor's office and to hear a person say, you know, checks have come out, and that just means there's going to be a bunch of drunk drivers out there tonight. So, you know, if you're not dried out, I want you to consider seeking treatment. Yeah, it's difficult to grow up in a minority group where there are assumptions made about you and there's no counter narrative. When I was a kid, we read the book Little House in the Big Woods. Do you remember that? And we all dressed up for what was the name of the game, you guys? I'm looking at people around my same age. You played like the Pioneer game where you would go out the Oregon Trail. Do you guys remember doing the Oregon Trail game? And I remember coming dressed up, you know, as Laura Ingalls with a big floppy bonnet on and a floral gingham skirt, and telling my teacher, hey, you know, I'm dressed up as Laura Ingalls, and being told, no, you can't be. That's not you. You're one of the Indians. It's very difficult to grow up in a society that has deemed you to be other and unworthy without any kind of counter-narrative or context, where assimilation feels like it's the only possibility for success. Okay, back to the role of the church. The church had such a big role in creating the Doctrine of Discovery to begin with. And the church has an important role in dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. I was approached several years ago when ICWA was first struck down. I was approached by folks at the National Indian Child Welfare Association. They had read an essay that I wrote, and they said, hey, do you think you could get Christians to care about ICWA? I said, yeah, I think I can. They said, we only have had one Christian entity ever participate in any litigation about ICWA, and they are for striking down ICWA. They filed an amicus brief in support of the position that ICWA is unconstitutional. So the coalition, this is several years ago, we said, hey, let's start holding candlelight vigils and demonstrate that we do support ICWA. And let's write letters to the editor. Let's publish papers and articles. Let's complexify the narrative about ICWA. ICWA is not about giving poor kids a good home. ICWA is about self-determination and sovereignty for Indigenous nations. And so you see some pictures here of congregations across the United States and colleges and various religious entities demonstrating their support for ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. And in fact, I have brought a banner here tonight that says, we support ICWA, ask us why. And anyone who would like to, I'd love to have a picture that I'll post on our Facebook page of this event, showing people coming together at the community level who are willing to stand up for ICWA. And no pressure if you don't want to be in the picture, but if you do, it would be lovely. Okay. So we have one more small group activity. Next slide, please. I wonder, what is one thing you're taking away from our time together this evening? What is one thing you're taking away from our time together this evening? But before we do that, I think I want to ask if you have comments or questions or things you would like to talk about before we go on to our final reflection.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the children who, maybe like yourself, don't have legal membership in a tribe, and how we can care for them when they don't fall under ICWA, but are Native American.
So you're asking about kids who are being placed? Okay, so child placement for kids who aren't protected by ICWA. Yeah, that is a deep question. And it's getting out into choppy territory here. So friends, forgive me for going into some places that might be hard. I think anytime a child is placed in a foster home or an adoptive home, a child of color that's being placed with people that are from the dominant culture, there's a great deal of care that has to be taken in advocating for that person. Because we don't all have the same experience walking around in the world. We just don't. Our experience of reality is different. So many people in the dominant culture believe that institutions are basically good and that we are basically safe and that if you follow the rules, things will pretty much be okay. That's not universal, but many people believe that. Because for many people in the dominant culture, institutions have been there to serve you or do a pretty good job of being predictable. And so that is a common experience of reality. And people of color don't necessarily experience institutions in the same way. So for example, Native women in the United States have the worst maternal health, access to maternal health of any group in the country, and there's higher infant mortality than any other race. Why do you think that is? Well, I'm going to say it might have something to do with 25 to 50% of them being sterilized in the 1970s involuntarily. There's a high degree of suspicion of the medical establishment because of that, right? And that is common among many institutions. There is not necessarily an assumption that schools are there to serve you or that that police are there to serve you, because that has not been the lived experience. So it can be very confusing for a child that is being raised in a culture or a family of the dominant culture who doesn't have that experience to have such a different experience. I think it's important to just say our family, we are advocates for people of color. We acknowledge that racism exists, and we as a family are going to work together to oppose that. You know what I mean? Because I think that it's possible for all people to understand that, but I do think it takes an active step to advocate for kids of color. Does that make sense? To proactively advocate for kids of color. And to acknowledge, on a daily basis, racism exists, to call it out when you see it. Oh my gosh, I saw this. This is what happened. I think often we want to protect our kids from that. We don't want to talk about it, but I think we have to talk about it a lot and affirm that this experience is real, because it can feel so disorienting when the people around you believe everything's fine and you don't experience everything as fine. So for example, in Washington State, we know our legislature affirmed that kids of color were sent to detention and expelled at higher rates than white kids for doing exactly the same kind of infraction. We know that disproportionality exists, and I think that it's important in interpersonal relationship to name that with kids, because they're growing up and they need to hear that affirmed, that their experience of reality is real.
I was telling somebody earlier, but they ended up, I went through that assimilation era where I was taken away when I was 5, and my older brother, a year older than I, went through the same foster homes and adopted home. And we went through that change of faith, belief, going through 2 foster homes and adopted out. We went through both Jewish and 3 different Protestant backgrounds and our Catholic background growing up. But I would have to say that I was able to go full circle and come back to my Skokomish background of the tribe I'm from, and be able to start learning my language and our belief of our native Northwest people are both the Smokehouse and Longhouse people and the Shaker Church background.
Thank you. Yes.
Sarah, I have a complexity I want to bring up, and it's not as a rebuttal about ICWA. I am with you. But I had an experience, and I just wondered if you could shed light or tell me what you think about this. For a period of a couple years, I worked for an adoption agency, Open Adoption and Family Services, which is a progressive, domestic, open adoption agency that's in Portland and Seattle. As an adoption counselor, it was sort of an odd era of my life. I don't really know exactly how I found myself doing that work, but it was incredible work. And so that was my first introduction to ICWA. And some of the experiences, or some of the things that happened was like a woman, a young woman would voluntarily she would choose adoption. And in this agency, the pregnant person got to choose the parents, the adoptive parents, who would put, beautiful profiles out. And there was only a small number of people in the adoptive parent pool that were Native, but there were some. And so sometimes what happened is a woman would discover that she had a percentage of Native American, I'm sure you're familiar with all this, of Native American ancestry, and so ICWA would come into effect. And I knew several cases where women changed felt like they were forced to parent because ICWA was invoked, and the option was that the child would have to be given to a relative that they did not want the child to be placed with. And so there were several cases where this would happen. And so it was weird because my introduction to ICWA was like, oh no, ICWA might be invoked, like, oh, like kind of this thing, because it would take away the woman's self-determination about what she wanted to have happen with the child in this open adoption. So I just wondered if you could speak to that. I know that there are people in that community who have ambivalent feelings about ICWA because of those kinds of experiences.
Oh yes, ICWA is very controversial in Native America. Yeah, it is not a monolithic view about it. And so I am going to just talk about the reality of child welfare in general. Most kids that are placed in a foster home are not adopted. Lots of kids are placed in a foster home and they're in foster care their whole childhood. It's very common. And our foster care system, you know, in the United States, of course, that is regulated state by state. Each state has its own foster care system. But state foster care systems are not in this stellar place where they can just take a bunch more kids. It's not like we have this system for the dominant culture where there's no problem with it. It's a challenging and difficult and complex situation. And ICWA is not perfect. And one of the things I want to bring up is that this is kind of a common fallacy, this idea of comparing to the ideal instead of the real. So saying, we don't like this because it's not the way it could be at its best in a perfect world. I would like to compare it to the way things really are in the real world. And the comparison to ICWA is the mainstream child protective services. So ICWA does, in fact, give tribes the opportunity to have a say in the placement of a child. That doesn't mean that every tribe pursues that in every case. It doesn't mean that Native kids are never adopted by white families. What it does is it honors the self-determination of a sovereign government to make decisions. So every state has its own child welfare program. They're not all the same. And so the way it works in California, there could be people in California who have a really good idea about how it should be, and they could say, we don't like how people in Alaska are doing it. Alaska has the lowest placement rate. I think Rhode Island has the highest. Maybe that's the case. So then Rhode Island says, well, we don't like how Alaska is doing it, so we're going to impose, our rules onto Alaska. You don't have the right to do that. And Indigenous tribes are sovereign like states. They have rules and how they do things, and they have the right to make those decisions. And I hear what you're saying about mother's self-determination, and far be it for me to undermine any mother's self-determination. And there are, I'm guessing, a few cases where that's the case, and we can't make a decision to find a law unconstitutional for the entire country. That's rough, because most kids are going to be like my dad. They're going to end up in a foster home and they're going to live there their whole life. There aren't all of these adoptive families waiting with open arms. If there were, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in the child welfare system today. So there's my imperfect answer or reflection.
I'm just curious how and if blood quantum factors into Doctrine of Discovery and the child welfare.
Yeah, blood quantum. It's a tricky conversation. I keep looking over at my friend Jim to help me out. Okay, so the first thing to know is that every federally recognized tribe determines who is a citizen of that tribe. So just like in Washington State, I don't know, many of you are probably born here. Anybody move here from somewhere else? I did. And so one of the first things I had to do was establish residency. And so I established residency based on the rules of Washington State. Washington determines what you have to do to be a resident. And every state's different, you know, how you establish residency. I mean, probably some of them are in common, but they're not all exactly the same. And tribes are the same way. So tribes determine who is a citizen and what the rules are to become a citizen. And many tribes require blood quantum. So blood quantum, you know, is based upon a record of what your ancestry is, and it's calculated, you know, what percentage of blood you are of that nation. And so some tribes say, in order to be a tribal citizen, you have to have blood quantum of 25%. And some tribes say you have to have 50%. Some tribes don't use blood quantum at all because tribal affiliation is a political designation. It is not a racial one. So let me give you an example, shocking example. There were, in the early days of the formation of the United States, what were called the 5 civilized tribes. Among them were the Cherokee. And the Cherokee conformed with many of the values of the United States, and there were Cherokee people who owned slaves. And so there are people, black people, who have tribal affiliation because there was a treaty or there was a decision that was made at emancipation that all of those slaves that were held by Cherokees would be members of the Cherokee Nation. You didn't have to have one drop of Cherokee blood to be a Cherokee citizen because tribal affiliation is a political designation, not a racial one. That's my short answer. I could go on and on about it, but I think that's where I'll leave it for tonight.
I have a lot of questions about cultural resilience. And it's remarkable to me how over multiple generations of assimilation, there can be such a drive among individuals to find their cultural identity. And I'm just curious, if nothing else, you know, what that path has looked like for you.
Yeah, you bet. I'd be happy to share that with you. Of course, I wrote about it a fair amount in my book. Yeah, so just a little bit more information about me, maybe oversharing. I am for social justice. You may have guessed that, but it's true. And the way I have experienced this is as a burning. So sometimes I get exhausted and I feel like, oh, I'm done, you know, just forget it. And in the morning I wake up and it's still burning. Doesn't go away, it's still there, burn, burn, burn. So when I first started working on the Doctrine of Discovery, it was because I met this man named Bob Miller. He actually came to the Yakima Reservation. He wrote a book, a now very famous book, on the Doctrine of Discovery called Native America, Discovered and Conquered. And when he came and gave this talk at the library there on the reservation, I think there were 3 people that came to his talk. Me, my husband, and an elder that very quickly kind of took a nap. He's a legal scholar, and he gave this talk. I was impressed. I bought his book. I read his book. You know, I wrote a book now based on his book loosely. And we've worked together a ton over time. But anyway, I met Bob Miller. That was how I heard of the Doctrine of Discovery the first time. I read his book. And then ultimately, the World Council of Churches, through a strange twist of fate, asked me to write the statement repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery on behalf of the more than 350 member churches of the World Council of Churches. And I was like, that sounds hard. Plus, I'm not a pastor or anything. But anyway, I ended up working on that and got to work with elders from all over the world on human rights and the Doctrine of Discovery kind of in the beginning through the World Council of Churches. And I met Stan McKay, who's a Cree elder. Canadian elder, and he mentioned this burning. He said, I notice you're burning. I was like, funny you should notice that. That's true. I really do experience it as burning. And he said, oh, it's unusual. You really need water ceremony to help deal with that. I was like, what the heck does that mean? I don't know what that means. I'm a fully assimilated person. And so I asked my friend Mark MacDonald, who ended up being the Archbishop of the Anglican Church of Canada, the Indigenous guy. I said, what do I do? And he said, well, I'm going to help you get in touch with an elder from your own home turf, which he did. That changed my life. And so I got to sit in ceremony with a lot of elders, especially at first it was men because I was working with the church. So pretty much all the church Native people I met at first were men, but eventually got acquainted with Native women and got to sit in ceremony on my own place and got to know the women and men from my own territory who taught me how to pray and how to walk with dignity and pride, how to hold my head up. And my mentor, Steve Darden, told me, don't ever speak for yourself. Those days are gone. And don't ever apologize for speaking for your people. And so anytime I speak about this, I wear this to remind myself, I'm not speaking for myself. I'm speaking for my people. And that's a privilege, even though it's sometimes hard to do. So yeah, a little bit. Sorry, first then you.
My question is, in the wake of January 6th and the insurrection, the word white Christian nationalism or Christian nationalism as a threat to democracy or political violence, or this is the way our country should be. Do you see where there's some intersection? Because if there are seats of power and influence with Christian nationalism and you're dismantling the doctrine of discovery, but some people would say that this is part of our nation. Do you see some of the work of these groups that are seeking to dismantle and those that are opposing Christian nationalism where they collide, or what can they do? I guess I kind of see a little bit of this, but do you see it yourself, or do you see some work that's being done to dismantle, not on a legal level, but as well address Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's also deep. It's a deep one. When I started working on the Doctrine of Discovery, I said that I felt like Frodo carrying the ring to Mordor. Because it was so rough, you start examining your own theology, the church that the church I grew up in and my own understanding of Christianity, it's heavy. It's tough. There's a lot of Native people who don't want to have anything to do with Christianity. It's only 5% is the number I've heard Native people practice Christianity. Yeah, and so white nationalism has always been rooted in the church, from my point of view. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan started as a Christian organization. I don't think I'm saying anything out of line in saying that. I think that's really true, and I think what I can do with my life energy is work with people in the church who are willing to do something else and to grow something else. And the coalition that I co-founded is ordinary people working day by day by day to seek justice and proactively. What we can do to uphold ICWA is to mess up the narrative right now that says that good Christian people should oppose ICWA. And we do that by speaking and by writing and by messing up that narrative. disrupting that narrative. And, you know, it's kind of a funny thing because we don't have direct influence over the Supreme Court. What we have direct influence over is our neighbors, right? So we want to exercise that. We want to mobilize to show up for something good. And I often think, you know, the people who created the structures that we live with now, the people who created the Doctrine of Discovery, they were Christian men. The people who have carried it out over the centuries, we're as smart as them. We're alive now, you know? I mean, they're not qualitatively better than than we are. We're smart. We can bring our brilliance and our energy to creating something else, to imagining and creating different structures. And that takes effort. And I think I would say, too, that solidarity is not, standing in solidarity with Indigenous people is not symbolic. It's not a metaphor. We have to show up and do it in fact, which means dismantling laws and policies that oppose the self-determination of Indigenous peoples. That means standing up for laws that uplift the self-determination of Indigenous peoples. And it means showing up with good theology in the church and demanding that. It is also calling on our church institutions to be a moral authority in the world and to not shrink from that, but to be willing to stand up and say, this is wrong, and we have to back up, we have to stop. And I am calling on churches to do that. And I ask you to join me. And I don't want to, you know, I'm not here to mobilize you particularly, but, you know, you consider joining the coalition. I was on a meeting, a Zoom meeting actually, for a women's district conference for the Mennonite Church a couple of months ago. And there was a lady there who was doing, you know, there were several presenters, and she was talking about her ladies' knitting group and what they were doing. And I said to the group, you know, you have to have more skills to be on that group than you do to join the coalition, because the coalition is made up of ordinary people who are ready to change the world together. And we do that together. We do it together in every way. Plug a few things. We've done everything from produced a play that went on tour across the nation. I think we have an album that's in production. Someone is making a board game, things like this. Yeah, we have a Doctrine of Discovery board game. We have a team working on that. We've also got a plank in the Democratic Party's platform in the state of California to dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery. We have passed legislation at the national level, inserting human rights language into the NICA Act. In defense of the Mosquito people of Nicaragua. So we're firing on all cylinders, and would love for you to join us. Oh, did I miss you? I did. Sorry, one more.
Thank you, Sarah. First, 2 comments and a question. Thank you for this evening, and also for writing this book, which I read about a year ago, and underlined and dog-eared all over the place, and wanted to connect with you directly. So, heard about you this afternoon to be here tonight, so thank you. Also, just as one of studied church history and as a trained theologian in my past as well, to recognize also that the church is not just a monolithic, right? That much of the church that cooperated in the Doctrine of Discovery, maybe not all, but most of them were victims and perpetuators of colonization themselves. So Christianity in Christendom was colonized in a sense. There's always been these other threads throughout history that have been oppressed by those colonized Christians and colonizers, and just in even Mennonites and others. And so just to acknowledge that, right? And also I just thank you, in your book gives hope and practicality, and personally also my work in the Native peoples in Northern Amazon, there was parallel stories to that for myself. I guess the question, because the church is a monolithic thing, and much of their, they got lands and they don't pay taxes, and they got a lot of benefits being part of, to give up, it's a lot of their identity and economics, especially of those that have been historically in such ways. Can you give some, maybe currently, any examples of, and I make a distinction between the church and then common believers in the following of Jesus, which is not empire or colonization. Any good stories of traction that we can do in our own community here, along with other believers in all walks of life and business owners. We employ Native peoples and from 3 or 4 different tribes currently. So I guess that's the thank you, and practically to join on a local level.
Yeah, so when we started organizing together nationally and then across North America, Mexico and Canada and the United States, one of the mechanisms that we used to bring people together, those people that wanted to work together, was we established what's called a repair network. So those groups of people who were willing to engage in repair. And the coalition has the ability to help establish a repair network. Often they're in congregations, but not always. We have a couple of universities, a couple of conferences who are part of our repair network, so that it's possible to work within your own community locally and then to also engage in the national and international work. And so that's the way we organize. And so for me, that is the work that gives me hope, is that we're growing year by year by year, people doing all kinds of things in their own communities, working together with the people of the lands that they're from, growing in relationship, and then also engaging in the larger work. So I would say, to speak to another point that you made, when I spoke with Benedictine University on Friday, I also spoke with the Scottish laity who were working on their presentation to the Pope, and said, hey, what would you like to ask the Pope? I said, how about some land back? The Catholic Church is the single largest landowner on earth. Private landowner on earth. Perhaps you could give some land back. That would be most appreciated. Yeah.
Sarah, thank you so much. I would like to turn to tomorrow. And you and I have talked about this, so this question will not be a surprise to you. But if we assume that the Supreme Court throws out 300 years of precedent and determines that the Indian Child Welfare Act turns on a racial distinction as opposed to a political distinction, what can we do? And I say this in the context of the state of Washington, where we have 35 indigenous nations, last counted, only 29 of which are federally recognized. And the others are not recognized in large part because of internecine tribal relations created by the availability of federal funds and authority. And we have a state that's committed itself to not only recognizing and adhering to precepts and principles of sovereignty and self-determination, but is operationalized those commitments. What can we do in the state of Washington to ensure that, notwithstanding a jurisprudential ruling by the Supreme Court that destroys federal Indian law, that we have the ability to protect, honor, and support the sovereignty of our nations?
So if you have a dear friend and colleague who happens to be a career Indian lawyer, you might not invite him to your talk. I'm kidding. my dear friend Jim Bamberger and colleague. Yeah, so we've been actually Jim and I have been talking a lot about this. How do we call Washington State to keep its commitments to our federally recognized tribes and those tribes seeking federal recognition? How can we hold our state accountable to the values that are in our state constitution? And I want to say that we must do that, and we better get to work. I think there are folks working on that, and I look forward to being part of that and connecting all of you to that work, because we are going to have to lift our voices to call for the self-determination of our own Native people here in the state of Washington. I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think we need to go into our last reflection question now. And so I'm wondering one thing that you're taking away, and let's just take a few minutes, just 1 or 2 minutes, each of you, to share with a partner. What's one thing that you're taking away from our time together? I'm so thrilled to see you all so engaged. We're actually at the end of our time, so I want to get at least a few comments. One thing you're taking away. I've been looking at you guys. I don't think I did pick on you once, didn't I?
I think despite what you say, your personal story, taking that away is a great window into the overall thesis that you're making. And I'm taking away, I think, the insight of your personal story. I mean, I intellectually know what the Indian Child Welfare Act says, and I've known for a long time, and I have some background in Indian law, but a lot of this is made more powerful by your personal story.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Take one more. What do you say?
I want to thank you for coming tonight. I've been working with the group, and this has helped me so much as I've stared at this problem and looked at what is happening with the Doctrine of Discovery to say, but what can I do? And now I have some ideas. Thank you.
You bet. And to that end, thank you. You're not a plant. Tell them that I didn't plant you. There's some literature in the front, and I'd love for you to take some flyers. I have one that is talking points for talking about ICWA. Please take one. Take a look at it. One of the things we did in the coalition is the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center asked for us to sign an amicus brief. And so we got 33 congregations across the nation to do that in 5 days. Yeah, who are willing to sign on, churches and universities, and I think a few others. And so the talking points talk about, breaking it down. We also have lesson plans. If you want to do a lesson plan at your own church for adult study or in your workplace, I would be happy to share. It's based on First Light, which is a short film about the ICWA Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Maine, the state of Maine. So I would gladly share that resource with you. But anyway, there's ICWA talking points. There are also talking points, the tough talking points. So responding to a Newsweek article that is explaining why ICWA is bad and wrong, and we have talking points to respond to that. There's also a flyer that's just about the coalition, thinking about joining the coalition. And there's another flyer about our repair network. So please take a look at those things. So grateful to get to have this time with you and to get to hear you share and to grow in community together. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Before you go, I just want to offer an invitation to you who are here. Sarah, you've offered so much of your story. You've shared with us the path of your life and your family. I just want to ask, for those of you who are comfortable, to offer a blessing to you. We know how to do this as humans. This is not, we can decolonize the powers that religion says it has and how we share blessings with each other. So either with your hands or sometimes with a hand or just with your heart. Just want to offer you a blessing, Sarah. I thank you for sharing the wounds that you brought to us tonight. May we hold those wounds and feel them. I want to thank you for sharing about your fire. Your fire, may it light fires within us too. I want to thank you for your steadfastness on this journey. May we learn the powers of endurance. And I just want to thank you for your vulnerability. May we learn the power of breaking open our own story for the transformation of the world. Thank you.
Who wants to be in a picture?
While you're gathering for that, is there anyone who would be able to put those flyers in a email that you can send out afterwards?
I think we've been forgotten for now.
I think anybody heard you, Kathy.
I'm guessing that they may post something on the event page.
Oh, yes, I'm sure there'll be a lot posted.
Yeah.
On whose event page?